16 years ago, Lieutenant General Dahi Khalfan Tamim stood before a bank of cameras in a Dubai government building and did something no police chief in the Arab world had done in decades. He named Mossad. He did not allege, he did not suggest. He held up photographs, 27 of them, men and women captured on closed-circuit cameras in hotel lobbies and airport corridors, and he said, with the flat certainty of someone who had already run the calculation 3 times, the Israeli intelligence service killed Mahmud al-Mabhouh in this city on January 19th, and we can prove it. The faces on those photographs belonged to British citizens, Australian citizens, Irish citizens, French and German nationals. Except they did not. The people who appeared on those passports were real. They had immigrated to Israel, paid taxes, raised children, lived ordinary lives in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Jerusalem. They had never been to Dubai. Their identities had been borrowed, cloned, or fabricated by an intelligence agency that had used the same technique for 30 years without serious consequence. For 3 decades, that technique had worked. It had worked in Europe, in South America, in the Arab world. It had placed operatives inside hostile countries with documents that passed scrutiny, documents connected to real people with real histories, documents that held up under pressure because the biographical foundation beneath them was genuine. The technique worked right up until it did not. And when it failed completely, in public, on camera, across 5 countries simultaneously. What destroyed 27 operational identities was not a mole inside Mossad. It was not a defection, not a signal intercept, not a double agent. It was a single document. One fraudulently obtained German passport, applied for with an Israeli document and a fictitious address, by a man who was later arrested in a Warsaw airport under a 3rd name. 1 thread. 27 faces. The most damaging self-inflicted intelligence exposure Israel had produced in the modern era. And at its center, a decision made by the director of Mossad himself, a decision he would later call, in the only public admission of its kind, a mistake that was his alone. This is how it happened, and what it cost the people who never consented to be part of it. Mahmud al-Mabhouh was born in 1960 in the Jabalia refugee camp in the northern Gaza Strip, the kind of place that produces men defined entirely by displacement. He was one of 14 siblings. He quit secondary school, trained as a mechanic, and eventually owned a small garage. None of that is particularly remarkable. What came next was, in the late 1980s, al-Mabhouh became one of the founders of the Izz ad-Din al-Qassam Brigades, the military wing of Hamas. He was not an ideologue in the public-facing sense. He was a planner, an organizer, a man who thought in logistics rather than theology. In 1989, he personally planned and oversaw the abduction of 2 Israeli soldiers, Avi Sasportas and Ilan Sadon. Both were killed. The operation placed al-Mabhouh on a list that Mossad maintained with the particular patience that characterized its most serious intentions. The list had a name inside the service. Operatives called it the Red Page. A Red Page designation meant a standing authorization to kill. It did not expire. Al-Mabhouh spent the 1990s moving. Gaza, Syria, Jordan, Iran. He built relationships with the Quds Force, the external operations arm of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, and those relationships became the foundation of a procurement network that, by the mid-2000s, was moving serious military hardware into Gaza. Anti-tank missiles, guided rockets, long-range projectiles that substantially extended Hamas's capacity to strike into Israeli territory. The supply chain he built was not simple. Shipments were organized in Tehran, routed through Port Sudan, moved overland through the Sinai Desert, and tunneled into Gaza through the network of underground passages that had become Gaza's primary import system after the blockade. Each leg of that route required contacts, arrangements, money moving through intermediaries, and someone who understood how to move weapons across 3 separate national jurisdictions without triggering the interdiction systems that multiple intelligence services were running against precisely this kind of traffic. Al-Mabhouh was that someone. By 2010, he was not a symbolic figure or a relic of Hamas's founding generation. He was an operational infrastructure. The weapons that Hamas fired into southern Israel passed through his hands or through systems he had personally built and continued to maintain. Removing him would not end Hamas's military capability, but it would disrupt the Iran-Hamas logistics chain at a moment when that chain was becoming significantly more capable. That was the calculation made in Tel Aviv, and it was not an unreasonable one. Dubai was where the calculation intersected with opportunity. Al-Mabhouh traveled there regularly, meeting arms dealers and Quds Force officers in a city that was, for the purposes of this kind of commerce, almost ideally arranged. It was cosmopolitan, heavily touristed, and commercially open. The emirate ran on the premise that business was business, and that the extraordinary mixture of nationalities and commercial purposes passing through its hotels and conference rooms was a feature to be celebrated rather than scrutinized. An Arab businessman meeting other men for discussions in a hotel lobby attracted no particular attention because the city had been built on exactly that kind of anonymity. Al-Mabhouh had visited Dubai 5 times in the previous year. He moved without bodyguards, apparently comfortable in what he understood as neutral ground. He told an Al Jazeera interviewer at some point before his death that you have to be alert. The comment suggested a man who understood the danger of his position but had made peace with it, or who had decided that the precautions he was taking were sufficient. When Al-Mabhouh booked his flight to Dubai in January 2010, he did so at short notice online from Damascus. He was on his way to Bangkok for a meeting. Dubai was a stopover, a transaction point, the kind of intermediate city that a logistics officer used because it was accessible from everywhere and connected to everything. He checked in under an alias, using one of the 5 passports he carried when traveling internationally. He checked into room 230 at the Al Bustan Rotana Hotel on the afternoon of January 19th. He left the hotel an hour later for a meeting. He returned. He did not appear concerned. Investigators would later reconstruct, from reporting in Al Hayat and from the Dubai police's own partially disclosed findings, what those hours outside the hotel contained. Al-Mabhouh met with individuals connected to the Iranian Revolutionary Guard's Quds Force. He was coordinating the next leg of a weapons shipment. The men he met with were in Dubai for exactly the reason Dubai existed in this part of the world. It was accessible from Tehran and from Khartoum and from Gaza in ways that no other city in the region was, and its commercial culture offered cover that no other city could match. When the Dubai police assembled their final timeline of January 19th, there was a 4-hour gap in their account, a period when Al-Mabhouh left the hotel for his meeting and was briefly out of the camera network's coverage. Dubai's police chief later acknowledged that gap in his public account of the investigation, and acknowledged further that what happened during those hours was something the Dubai authorities preferred not to detail publicly. The emirate had not known that a senior Hamas weapons coordinator was using its territory as a logistics hub. That knowledge, once it arrived, was not something the Dubai government had an interest in advertising. What al-Mabhouh did not know was that a Mossad surveillance unit operating under the Caesarea division had been tracking his movements for more than a year. They had penetrated his computer with a piece of software designed to harvest communications without detection. They had accessed his email server and were reading his correspondence. They knew the hotels he preferred. They knew which cities he transited and when. They had mapped his network of contacts to a degree that would have alarmed him considerably had he known. When the Dubai flight booking appeared in the monitored account, the Caesarea team had approximately 18 hours to assemble an operation. That was enough time to deploy, to coordinate surveillance, to position the team. It was not enough time to build clean new cover identities for 26 people. And that constraint, imposed by al-Mabhouh's booking pattern, was where the operation's failure began. The document program that sustained Mossad's field operations for 3 decades was neither simple nor improvised. It was a system, and like most intelligence systems, it had been designed to solve a specific problem, and had then continued long past the moment that problem changed shape. The fundamental challenge for any clandestine service operating in hostile or unfriendly environments is identity. An operative needs to enter a country without triggering scrutiny, operate without leaving traces that connect to their real identity, and exit without incident. The cleanest solution in theory is a completely fabricated identity built around a fabricated document. The problem is that fabricated documents fail. Border control systems in most developed countries cross-reference passport numbers against databases maintained by the issuing government. A number that does not appear in those databases, or that belongs to someone who died decades ago, or that has a format inconsistency a trained officer can identify, becomes a liability the moment someone looks closely. The solution Mossad arrived at, and that several other intelligence services had also discovered independently, was to anchor fabricated documents in real biographical identities. Not dead people who create their own verification problems when their death records appear in databases. Real, living people whose passport numbers appear in government systems because the passports were legitimately issued, whose birth records are genuine, whose biographies can be checked and will hold up because they are true. The source of those identities was the Jewish diaspora, specifically the movement of Jews from Western countries to Israel. The immigration process, called Aliyah, involved the surrender of identity documents during a bureaucratic intake procedure. From that pool, Mossad built a secondary system, approaching immigrants, particularly those who held Western citizenship, and requesting the temporary use of their passport details. The framing was low-key and usually informal. An individual who identified themselves, sometimes explicitly and sometimes not, as connected to Israeli security services would explain that the documents were needed for a period of about 18 months. The passport would be returned. The owner should avoid certain countries while the arrangement was in place. Some people agreed immediately, as an expression of loyalty to the state or simple compliance with an authority figure. Some asked questions and then agreed. Some were not asked at all, their details taken from immigration records without contact or consent. A report in the Times of London, published in 2010 and based on anonymous accounts from two young men, one who had emigrated from Britain and one from France, described how they had been approached during their Israeli military service and had lent their passport details without fully understanding what they were lending them for. When the documents came back after the agreed period, they contained entry and exit stamps for Azerbaijan, Turkey, and Russia. The young men were quietly advised not to visit those countries for a while. They did not press for an explanation. From documents anchored in these real identities, Mossad's technical division built operational legends. The document was not a forgery in the simple sense. It was a modified version of a real person's real passport. The same passport number, the same biographical data, but with a photograph substituted and the physical description adjusted to match the operative who would carry it. An operative entering a country under such a cover was presenting a document connected to a real human being, whose existence could be confirmed, because that human being actually existed and was an actual citizen of the issuing country. The system worked. For decades, it worked well enough that the institutional appetite for examining its failure modes remained limited. There had been incidents, specific moments when the method had produced diplomatic consequences. A bag containing 8 forged British passports was found in a West German telephone booth in 1986. The British government closed down Mossad operations in the United Kingdom and demanded assurances. The assurances were given. Margaret Thatcher accepted them. The practice continued. The deeper structural problem, the one that Dubai would eventually expose, was this: the method depended on infrequent use. Use a borrowed identity once in a city with limited surveillance infrastructure, and the identity stays clean. Use it 3 times in the same city, in a cluster with 25 other borrowed identities making the same trips, paying with the same type of payment card, routing their communications through the same relay number in Austria, and you have not protected your operatives. You have indexed them in a way that any competent investigator with access to hotel records and travel manifests can read. For the Dubai operation, the Caesarea unit had already sent advance teams to the city 3 times in the preceding 6 months. The same passports had been used on all 3 trips. When al-Mabhouh's booking appeared and Mossad director Mayor Dagan was briefed, the choice was to move with the existing documents or abort. Dagan approved the operation. By the account in intelligence historian Ronan Bergman's Rise and Kill First, Dagan dictated his authorization in 4 words: plasma screen, authorized for execution. Among the 26 operatives assembling in Dubai was one carrying a document that was different in kind from all the others. Not borrowed, not cloned from a real immigrant's identity. Obtained through a separate, more elaborate process, and carrying a different category of risk. The advance team was inside the Al Bustan Rotana Hotel before 6:30 in the morning, more than 9 hours before al-Mabhouh would arrive from Damascus. They moved in pairs and small clusters, having checked into different rooms across different hotels in the city and converging in loose formation, maintaining physical distance from each other while staying connected through the Vienna relay. The disguise work was documented later in forensic detail by the CCTV footage that Tamim's investigators would spend weeks cataloging. 2 operatives entered a hotel bathroom and emerged differently dressed, wearing wigs, their clothing changed. A pair, wearing tennis whites, sat in the lobby for hours with towels over their shoulders and rackets in hand, the carrying cases conspicuously absent. Others wore clothing that suggested hotel staff. The tradecraft was not absent. It was simply inadequate for an environment fitted with the camera coverage the Al Bustan Rotana provided in its lobby, elevators, and corridors. A 4-person surveillance unit was at the airport when al-Mabhouh's plane arrived in the early afternoon and followed him to the hotel. He checked into room 230, left an hour later for a meeting elsewhere in the city, and returned that evening. During his absence, a specialist reprogrammed the electronic lock on his room door so that it would open with an unregistered keycard. Hotel electronic records would later show that the lock had been accessed approximately 30 minutes before the killing. When al-Mabhouh returned to room 230 in the early evening, 4 operatives were already inside. Dubai's forensic investigation established that he was first injected with succinylcholine, a fast-acting muscle relaxant used medically to achieve temporary paralysis before intubation. Succinylcholine does not sedate. The person who receives it loses the ability to move but retains full consciousness and full sensation. Physical evidence at the scene indicated that al-Mabhouh attempted to resist after the injection. He was then electrocuted and suffocated. The exact sequence of the final minutes remained disputed in subsequent forensic reports, a point of contention between Dubai's preliminary findings and later analysis. What was not disputed was the outcome. The operation had been designed so that the cause of death would not be immediately apparent. Succinylcholine metabolizes quickly in the body. The plan, as understood from subsequent reporting on the operation's design, was that by the time a hotel housekeeper found the body the following morning, the chemical signature would have degraded sufficiently that a standard forensic examination might not find it. The death might be attributed to a cardiac event or respiratory failure, the kind of result that a man in his 50s, under sustained operational stress, traveling internationally on a difficult schedule, could plausibly produce on his own. The cover story depended on the forensics being inconclusive. What it did not account for was Tamim ordering a thorough autopsy from the beginning, before the cause of death had been characterized as anything other than suspicious. The team dispersed. Most were gone from Dubai within hours of the killing, departing on flights to Frankfurt, Zurich, Rome, and Paris. The last members left the country within 24 hours. Hotel housekeeping knocked on the door of room 230 the following morning. There was no answer. The door was opened. al-Mabhouh was found dead. Hamas's armed wing issued a statement claiming he had died of terminal cancer in a hospital. The statement lasted approximately 48 hours before the autopsy results made it unsustainable. Tamim ordered a full homicide investigation. The operation had achieved its tactical objective. No member of the team had been detained in Dubai. The exit was clean. What had not been accounted for was what a motivated, well-resourced police chief would find when he started pulling the records of everyone who had been in that city when a Hamas official died under suspicious circumstances. Dahi Khalfan Tamim had spent 3 decades building Dubai's police force into something that its neighbors and peers had consistently underestimated. He was not, by the standards of regional policing, a conventional figure. He had trained at the Royal Police College in Amman and had spent his career building investigative infrastructure at a moment when Dubai was transforming from a trading port into one of the world's major commercial transit hubs. His airport personnel had been trained by European counterparts specifically to identify fraudulent travel documents. His CCTV network, by 2010, was not the rudimentary system that older intelligence protocols had been designed to evade. It was a high-resolution, comprehensive surveillance infrastructure covering the key transit points of a city through which millions of people moved every year. When Tamim's investigators began pulling footage, they started not with the day of the killing, but with al-Mabhouh's previous visits to Dubai. All 5 of them. They were looking for people who had been present at the same locations, across multiple trips, without an apparent business or personal reason to be there repeatedly. The hotel guest records, the airport manifests, and the CCTV archives from al-Mabhouh's prior trips were cross-referenced against each other. The pattern appeared quickly. A cluster of British, Irish, Australian, French, and German nationals had been in Dubai on each of al-Mabhouh's prior visits, staying at the same hotels, moving through the same corridors, arriving from and departing to the same European cities. The same passport numbers appeared in hotel records from multiple trips. A group of international travelers who appeared unconnected to each other had nonetheless synchronized their presence in the same city, orbiting the same target, at least 4 separate times. This was the structural consequence of reuse. A document used once creates one data point. A document used 4 times in the same city, in a cluster with 25 others following the same pattern, creates a fingerprint that any investigator with access to the records can read. The passports that had been designed to make the operatives invisible had, through the repetition required by the operation's timeline, made them exactly visible. The method that worked once was a liability the 4th time. The financial trail was the second convergence. The team had paid hotel bills and other expenses using prepaid debit cards issued by an American company called Payoneer. Prepaid debit cards were not a standard payment instrument in Dubai's hospitality sector, where business travelers typically used credit cards attached to corporate accounts. The use of a single card type, across multiple members of what should have been an unconnected group of international tourists, was an anomaly that hotel accounting records flagged cleanly. Investigators noted the Payoneer connection. They also noted that the company's founder had a background in the Israeli Defense Forces, though the company itself categorically denied any involvement in the operation or any knowledge of how its products had been used. The telephone records were the 3rd convergence point and perhaps the most technically decisive. The operatives had used mobile phones to coordinate, but had routed their communications through a single relay number in Vienna. The logic was sound in isolation. Calls that passed through an Austrian exchange left a European routing record rather than a direct communication between operatives in the same city. But investigators pulled the call logs for every phone associated with the identified suspects and found the same Austrian number appearing in each one, at critical junctures in the 48 hours surrounding the killing. 27 phones. The same relay. People who had no apparent connection to each other had all called the same number in Vienna at roughly the same times. The CCTV analysis assembled these threads into a visual narrative. Tamim's team worked through the footage chronologically, camera by camera, building a time-stamped record of the surveillance operation on al-Mabhouh from the moment his plane touched down to the moment the 4 operatives exited room 230. The tennis players sitting in the lobby for hours, the carrying cases missing from beside the rackets they held. The 2 figures entering a hotel bathroom separately and emerging looking different. the operative following al-Mabhouh from the elevator into his corridor and then withdrawing, the access to room 230's door lock before the target returned. Tamim called his press conference on February 15th. He released the photographs of the 27 suspects. He said he was 99% certain this was Mossad. He requested that the Dubai prosecutor issue arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Mossad Director Meir Dagon. The photographs and the aliases on the passports were entered into Interpol's database and placed on the most wanted list. In the cities where those suspects were supposed to live, real people recognized their own names on a television screen. In the weeks following the press conference, several of the real identity holders gave statements to the media in their home countries. They were careful statements, mostly, constrained by the awareness that anything they said would be parsed for what it revealed about what they had known or agreed to. Some denied any knowledge that their identity had been used. Some acknowledged having been approached in Israel but denied knowing the purpose. One anonymous British account, reported by the BBC, described a man who had immigrated to Israel years earlier and had been asked to lend his passport during his military service, had agreed, had received it back with stamps in it, and had not asked questions. He had not expected to see his name on a television screen in connection with a killing in a Gulf hotel. He had not expected to have his passport cancelled by the British government. He had not expected to spend weeks explaining to his employer and his neighbors that the name on the Interpol list was his name, but the person described was not him. The institution that had used his identity had no mechanism for addressing any of that. The institutional logic that had decided their identities were available for use had not fully modeled this outcome, or had modeled it and decided the probability was acceptable. A person in London or Sydney or Dublin who had lent their passport details years earlier, or whose details had been taken without their knowledge, now found their name listed as a suspect in a killing in a Gulf hotel. Their government had cancelled their passport. A replacement was being issued. The Interpol listing, connected to their real name, was in databases that would persist. The question that Dubai raised, and that the diplomatic crisis that followed never fully answered, was why Mossad had continued using a method it knew had a documented history of catastrophic failure. The answer is that the method had failed before, in ways that were humiliating and strategically costly, and the institution had absorbed those failures without altering the underlying practice. To understand Dubai, you have to go back 13 years to the Jordanian capital. In September 1997, Benjamin Netanyahu was in his first term as prime minister, and the relationship between Israel and Hamas was in one of its most volatile periods. The Oslo peace process was fragmenting. Hamas had conducted a series of suicide bombings inside Israel that had killed dozens of civilians and created enormous political pressure on the government. Netanyahu wanted results from his intelligence services. Mossad was under significant institutional pressure to demonstrate operational capability in the specific area of targeted action against senior Hamas figures. The target chosen was Khalid Mashal, the head of Hamas's political bureau, operating from Amman under the protection of King Hussein. Jordan had signed a peace treaty with Israel only 3 years earlier, in 1994, a treaty that represented a significant diplomatic achievement and that both governments had invested considerable effort in sustaining. Mishal was in Amman legally, visibly with Jordanian tolerance. An operation against him in the Jordanian capital was not a strike against an enemy combatant in a war zone. It was an assassination in an allied country, conducted without that country's knowledge or consent. For their cover, the Mossad operatives used Canadian passports. The arrangement was the same as it had always been. Canadian Jews living in Israel had been approached and asked whether their passport details could be borrowed for an operation. They agreed. The documents the operatives carried were built around real Canadian identities, real people whose existence in Canadian government databases could be confirmed. On September 25, 1997, 2 operatives approached Mashal on a public street in Amman. One pressed a device against his ear that delivered a dose of levofentanyl. a synthetic opioid designed to kill slowly enough that the cause of death might not be immediately apparent. The method was intended to look like a natural health episode. It did not. Michal's bodyguard saw the approach and reacted. The two operatives ran. They were caught by Jordanian security within hours, carrying their Canadian passports and, beneath the passports, their Israeli identity documents. The two men took refuge inside the Israeli embassy in Amman. King Hussein called the White House. The tone of that call, as reconstructed from multiple accounts, was not diplomatic in any formal sense. The king told the Clinton administration that unless Israel delivered the antidote to the poison within hours, the two Mossad officers would be handed to Jordanian police, and the peace treaty signed in 1994 would be under immediate reconsideration. The king had invested a significant portion of his political legacy in that treaty. He was not speaking rhetorically. Netanyahu complied. The antidote was delivered. Michal survived. But the negotiation to extract the two operatives and restore the Israeli-Jordanian relationship continued beyond the medical emergency. As part of the settlement, Israel was eventually compelled to accept. Sheikh Ahmed Yassin was released from prison. Yassin was the founder of Hamas. He had been imprisoned since 1989. He was 60 years old, partially blind, and had been confined to a wheelchair since a childhood accident. He was also, in the eyes of Hamas's membership and a substantial portion of the Palestinian population, a figure of extraordinary symbolic and organizational authority. When he was returned to Gaza, the reception was enormous. He was carried through crowds, he gave interviews, he spoke about the movement he had built. The operation intended to eliminate a senior Hamas political figure had freed the organization's founder. Within 7 years, Yassin would be killed in an Israeli helicopter strike. But the institution he had created, the one that produced al-Mabhouh and the weapons procurement networks and the Qassam brigades, had been reinvigorated by his release in ways that outlasted his death. Canada expelled the Mossad station chief from Ottawa. Israel gave formal assurances that Canadian passports would not be used again. Similar assurances had been given to Britain in 1986 after the West German telephone booth incident. The assurances were given sincerely enough to manage the diplomatic moment. The method continued. The institutional logic was coherent within its own frame. The technique failed when something else in the operation failed. The 1997 failure was attributed to the botched execution on the street, not to the decision to use Canadian identities. Fix the execution and the documents remain viable. This was the logic that Dagan was operating inside when he approved Plasma Screen. He was not wrong that the method had worked for decades. He was wrong about what the world in 2010 looked like compared to the world the method had been designed for. Of the 27 suspects identified by Tamim's investigation, 26 were carrying documents built on borrowed identities, real names anchored in real people whose existence in national databases could be confirmed. Those documents were resilient in a specific way. Proving they were operational covers, rather than legitimate travel documents used by private individuals for private purposes, required either the voluntary cooperation of the real identity holders or direct access to Mossad's internal records. Neither was available to Dubai's investigators or to the governments whose passport offices had been exploited. The 27th document was different in kind. Michael Bowdenheimer was the name on a German passport. The person who had obtained it was in Dubai under that name on January 19th, and would later be identified in German legal proceedings and European press as Uri Brodsky, also known as Alexander Varen. The basis used to claim German citizenship, and through it a German passport, was that Bowdenheimer's father had been a Holocaust refugee born in Germany. This was a specific legal mechanism the German government had established to allow descendants of Jews expelled from Germany during the Nazi period to reclaim citizenship. It was a pathway designed as an act of historical repair. The application for the German passport had been made using an Israeli identity document. The address provided in the application was fictitious. When German federal investigators, responding to inquiries generated by the Dubai case, pulled the application file for Michael Bowdenheimer, they found the Israeli document reference in the record and ran the address. The street did not exist. The building number had no corresponding structure. The documentation chain that should have supported a legitimate citizenship claim came apart inside a single afternoon of file review in a federal office in Cologne. From the application file, investigators could identify the Israeli document that had been used to make the claim. That document pointed to a real person, or at least a real identity that could be located. The chain connecting the Bowdenheimer passport to a traceable individual was not theoretical. It was in a German federal archive with a case number attached. The European arrest warrant was issued. German authorities asked Polish counterparts to watch for Brodsky. In June 2010, 5 months after the killing, Polish police detained a man at Warsaw Frederick Chopin Airport who was traveling under the name Yuri Brodsky. The German warrant specified that Brodsky was suspected of illegally obtaining the German passport used by the person identified in Dubai as Michael Bowdenheimer. What followed was a negotiation that moved partly outside the standard judicial channels. A bail of 100,000 euros was arranged. Brodsky was transferred to Germany. He then departed Germany for Tel Aviv in a period that multiple sources described as extraordinarily rapid, given the seriousness of the charges. German authorities tried him in absentia and fined him 60,000 euros. In January 2011, they issued an international arrest warrant. It has not been executed. He has not returned to Germany. Former Mossad officer Dan Magan, writing in his 2017 account of the agency, described the Bowdenheimer passport as the smoking gun of the entire operation. He was precise about what made it distinctively damaging. It was not that it was the most significant tactical failure of January 19th. The CCTV evidence, the Payoneer payment trail, and the Vienna relay had already been enough to identify 26 suspects and connect them to the killing. What the Bowdenheimer document did was convert an intelligence inquiry into a criminal proceeding. It gave foreign governments something they could act on in open court with documented evidentiary files. That was a different category of problem, and it was the category of problem that transformed a bilateral diplomatic complaint into an internationally documented legal matter with an arrest, a prosecution, and a conviction, however nominal, in a European court. Because Brodsky had been arrested on a real warrant backed by a real case file, the foreign governments whose passport holders were listed on Interpol could no longer treat Dubai's allegations as the assertions of a foreign police force operating in an unaligned jurisdiction. It was a European arrest warrant matter, processed through Interpol, with a German federal prosecution attached. The man at the center of it had fled to Israel immediately upon release. That sequence of events was, by itself, a complete account of what had happened, requiring no inference and no interpretation. Britain moved first. In March 2010, Foreign Secretary David Miliband stood in the House of Commons and reported the findings of the Serious Organized Crime Agency investigation into the use of British passports in the Dubai killing. The SOCA report had concluded that there was compelling evidence that Israel was responsible. An Israeli diplomat was expelled from London. The parliamentary debate was notable for the institutional memory it surfaced. Members who had followed Israeli intelligence operations pointed out, with precision, that assurances had been given before. After 1986, after other incidents handled quietly enough to avoid sustained press attention. Those assurances had not changed the practice. They had changed the diplomatic temperature for a period and then been set aside. Australia followed in May. Foreign Minister Stephen Smith confirmed there was no doubt that Israel was behind the forgery of 4 Australian passports. An Israeli diplomat was expelled from Canberra. Ireland's Department of Foreign Affairs issued a statement arriving at the inescapable conclusion that an Israeli government agency was responsible for the misuse and most likely the manufacture of the forged Irish passports. An Irish diplomat was withdrawn from Dublin. France and Germany issued formal protests. The European Union's foreign ministers collectively condemned the use of forged European passports. The condemnation was unanimous across governments with substantially different dispositions toward Israel. Inside Israel, the government maintained its formal posture of neither confirming nor denying involvement. The military censorship system initially required domestic media to attribute the Dubai allegations to foreign media reports, a legal formality designed to sustain official ambiguity. The formality lasted approximately 1 week before Israeli journalists and editors abandoned it, the volume and specificity of the evidence having made the pretense unsustainable. Israeli opinion divided not over what had happened, but over whether it had been worth it. One position held that the tactical success, al-Mabhouh was dead, warranted the diplomatic cost, and that embarrassment was the predictable price of serious intelligence work. The opposing position, articulated most directly by Haaretz's military correspondent, was that an intelligence service that had produced this quality of evidence trail in a city with full camera coverage had demonstrated a category of sloppiness incompatible with continued leadership by the director who had approved the operation. Neither argument engaged fully with the specific nature of the damage. 27 operational covers burned permanently. The mechanics of Mossad's document sourcing method detailed in parliamentary debates and foreign ministry statements across 5 countries. The Vienna relay system, the Payoneer payment approach, and the pattern of document reuse across multiple trips, all of it in the public record in enough detail that any competent intelligence service could read it as an operational manual on what to look for. Dubai and Israel reportedly had no meaningful contact for 18 months. The United States helped facilitate a resumption of communication. No Israeli official acknowledged responsibility through any official channel. The CCTV footage, the European arrest warrant, the parallel diplomatic expulsions, and the Australian government's statement that there was no doubt about Israeli involvement had collectively produced a public record that official ambiguity could not undo. The real identity holders, the men and women in Britain and Australia and Ireland and France whose names had appeared on passports used in a killing they knew nothing about, were living with consequences that no diplomatic exchange addressed. Their names were in searchable databases connected to an Interpol Most Wanted listing. Their passports had been cancelled. Replacements had been issued. The original listing remained. Meir Dagan left Mossad in late 2010. His departure was described in Israeli reporting in ways that varied by outlet. A resignation driven by policy disagreements with Netanyahu over how to handle the Iranian nuclear program, or a dismissal following Dubai. The distinction was never publicly clarified. He had served 8 years, longer than any Mossad director in the modern history of the agency. He had rebuilt its operational emphasis from intelligence gathering toward active measures, had overseen significant operations against the Iranian nuclear program, and had produced, as a capstone of his tenure, the most publicly documented intelligence failure Israel had generated in decades. Dagan did not speak publicly about plasma screen for years. When he did, it was in an interview with Ronen Bergman conducted for Raise and Kill First, the comprehensive history of Israeli targeted killings published in 2018. Dagan knew the book was being written. He knew his role in the Dubai operation would be addressed. The admission he gave was precise in a way that left no room for later qualification. He said, "I was wrong in sending the team in with those passports. It was my decision and only my decision. I bear the full responsibility for what happened." The statement was published 2 years after his death. Dagan died of liver disease in March 2016 at 61. In the years between his departure from Mossad and his death, he had become a significant public voice against military action on Iran, arguing that a strike would produce consequences far more damaging than the nuclear program it intended to stop. He was a former intelligence chief who had become a public critic of the government he had served. He did not live to see his Dubai admission in print. The accountability it represented, specific and attributed and irrevocable, arrived after he was gone. Uri Brodsky was fined 60,000 euros by a German court operating in his absence. He was not extradited. He was not tried in open court. He departed Germany for Tel Aviv within hours of bail being arranged and has not returned. The international arrest warrant issued in January 2011 remains active in the formal sense. It has not been executed. The 27 operatives whose photographs were released and whose aliases were entered into Interpol's records are finished as clandestine officers. Their faces are in archives that border control and intelligence systems cross-reference. The anonymity that covert fieldwork requires, once lost in this specific way, cannot be reconstructed. Some of those burned were experienced Caesarea officers who had spent years building the kind of invisible professional history that the intelligence world calls a legend. That work was erased in a press conference in Dubai. Mahmud al-Mabhouh left behind a wife and 4 children in Gaza. His nephew Ahmad became an engineering and explosives officer in a Hamas unit near Jabalia. Ahmad al-Mabhouh was killed in an Israeli strike during the 2014 Gaza conflict. The structures his uncle had built continued past his death and past the deaths of those who came after. Dahi Khalfan Tamim stated publicly in September 2010 that he had received death threats he attributed to Mossad in connection with his investigation. Whether those threats existed as described was not independently confirmed. He served as Dubai's police chief until November 2013. He remains a public figure in the United Arab Emirates, active on social media, outspoken on regional politics. He is the officer who assembled 27 photographs and walked into a room full of cameras and said, with no apparent hesitation, what he was looking at. The question of what the Dubai operation changed inside Mossad's doctrine is difficult to answer from outside the institution. The most visible change was in the passport methodology itself. In the years following Dubai, multiple reporting threads and subsequent incidents suggested that the practice of using borrowed foreign national identities was significantly curtailed, at least in allied Western countries. The 2010 exposure had made the mechanism too well documented to use without risk of immediate recognition. Whether the underlying practice stopped entirely or was simply modified to be less detectable is not something the public record can settle. Intelligence services do not publish their doctrine revisions. What they publish are the outcomes of the operations that survive long enough to become history. The weapons network that al-Mabhouh had been running required reorganization after his death. It was reorganized. Iranian materiel continued to move into Gaza through the period following his killing. The 2014 Gaza conflict demonstrated that Hamas's military capability had not been fundamentally degraded by the removal of one logistics officer. The question of whether a single individual's elimination could achieve strategic disruption rather than temporary interruption had been answered, though not in the terms the operation's planners had used. The operation succeeded in the narrow sense that its practitioners used that word. Mahmud al-Mabhouh was dead. The mission's tactical objective was achieved. No member of the team was detained in Dubai. The exit was clean. But something else had happened in the weeks that followed, something that the clean exit did not prevent, and that official silence in the months afterward could not contain. The method that had protected Mossad's field officers for 30 years was now a documented case study, circulated across 5 governments, debated in a British parliamentary chamber, processed through a German federal prosecution, and entered into the public record with enough specificity that any competent intelligence service in the world could read exactly how it worked and exactly how to look for it. The technique had been invisible. It became catastrophic the moment it was seen. And what made it visible was not a failure of operational security in the conventional sense, not a blown cover or a turned asset or a signal intercept. It was the accumulated weight of the method's own reuse, expressed in passport numbers that appeared too many times in hotel records that were too well organized, in a city that had been too thoroughly filmed. Dagan's admission was careful about what it conceded. He said he was wrong to send the team in with those passports, not wrong to authorize the operation. Not wrong about the target, wrong about the documents. The distinction is worth holding. It means the institutional judgment about al-Mabhouh was considered sound. The error was in the method. The same calculation with cleaner documents, properly separated from prior trips, would presumably have been authorized again. That is what Dubai quietly settled. Not whether Mossad would continue operations of this kind, it would, but whether the infrastructure that had made them deniable for 30 years remained viable in a world where cities had begun filming everything, where financial transactions left digital traces that could be cross-referenced across jurisdictions in hours, where a single fraudulent application in a German Federal Records Office could unravel a 27-person operational network assembled over months. The world Mossad had been designed to operate in had changed. The method had not changed with it. Dubai was where that gap became visible. And the people who paid most concretely for that visibility were not the officials who had authorized the operation or the officers who had carried it out and returned safely to Tel Aviv. They were the people in London and Sydney and Dublin and Paris whose names had been on the passports, who had not been in Dubai, and who found out from the news. If you follow the history of intelligence operations and the decisions that shaped the world they produced, subscribe to Hidden Ops, new documentaries released regularly.